Russia-Ukraine war, list of key events. Fighting. At least 18 people were killed and more than 130 injured after Russia targeted Ukraine's major cities in a wave of missile strikes, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said. Russia launched nearly 40 missiles of different types in another combined strike to try to circumvent our air defense system, he said in a somber evening address, warning the death toll could rise. 8 people were killed in Kharkiv, Ukraine's second biggest city, which was hit by 3 waves of attacks. Dozens of Kyiv residents were also injured after Russian missiles hit apartment blocks in the capital. Celeste Wallander, an assistant secretary of defense at the United States Pentagon, said the Russian missile and drone attacks were part of an attempt by Moscow to find weaknesses in Ukraine's military while additional U.S. funding for security assistance is tied up in Congress. Russia's defense ministry claimed its air assault on Ukraine targeted companies producing weapons, missiles and ammunition and had been successful. Asked by reporters about the raids and civilian casualties, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said the Russian military does not hit social facilities and residential neighborhoods and does not hit civilians. Politics and diplomacy. Turkey's parliament voted 287 to 55 to ratify Sweden's NATO membership after more than a year of delays that frustrated Western efforts to show resolve in the face of Russia's war on Ukraine. NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg welcomed the Turkish move and said he was counting on Hungary to complete its national ratification as soon as possible. Hungary's populist Prime Minister Viktor Orban said earlier he had invited his Swedish counterpart Ulf Kristersson to Budapest to negotiate the accession deal. Russia rejected allegations that it had forcibly deported Ukrainian children to Russia. Ukraine has said that 20,000 children have been forced to move to Russia since the war erupted in February 2022. The International Criminal Court last year issued arrest warrants for Russian President Vladimir Putin and his children's commissioner over the transfers. The U.S. Central Intelligence Agency released a Russian-language video to try and persuade Russian intelligence employees to switch sides and work as double agents for Washington, amid perceived disaffection over the war in Ukraine. The documentary 20 Days in Mariupol was nominated for an Oscar. The film recounts the Russian siege and brutal capture of the Ukrainian port city in 2022. Weapons. NATO signed a €1 billion, $1. 2 BN, deal to buy 220,000 rounds of 155mm artillery shells for Ukraine. The shells are not expected to arrive in the country for 2 to 3 years. Coordinated raids in 5 European countries led to the arrest of 3 people in the Netherlands suspected of breaking sanctions to export technological and lab equipment to Russia that could have military uses, EU judicial agency Eurojust said. U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin opened a monthly meeting of about 50 nations that coordinate support for Ukraine against Russia, but did not announce any new U.S. aid for Kyiv. Funding has been blocked by Republicans who want more action on U.S. border issues. Austin joined the meeting from home where he is recovering from surgery for prostate cancer. Russia-Ukraine war, list of key events. Russia said it would take all necessary measures to defend its citizens and key infrastructure from Ukrainian attacks. On Sunday, 2 alleged Ukrainian drones hit a major Baltic Sea terminal, starting a fire. Towns near the border, including Belgorod, have also come under fire with at least 21 people killed in an attack at the end of last year. Kyiv said it shot down 8 Russian attack drones launched against southern and central regions of the country. Politics and diplomacy. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov clashed with the United States and Ukraine at a United Nations Security Council meeting where Moscow ruled out any peace plan backed by Kyiv and its Western allies, and China warned that further global chaos could impact the slowing global economy. Lavrov dismissed Kyiv's peace plan as a road to nowhere. On a visit to Kyiv, Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk promised to keep supporting Ukraine against Russia's invasion, which he described as a battle between good and evil. He also said he wanted to resolve differences over grain shipments and trucking that had recently soured ties between the neighbors. The website for Russian politician Boris Nadezhdin, who has criticized the invasion of Ukraine as a fatal mistake, said he had so far secured some 85,000 signatures backing him as a candidate in the March presidential election. Under Russian electoral law, Nadezhdin needs 100,000 signatures by the end of January to be allowed to run. Russia's parliament began considering a bill that would allow the state to seize the property of those convicted of defamation of the security forces, including by criticizing the war in Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky thanked Ukrainians abroad for their support during Russia's invasion and proposed changing the constitution to allow for dual citizenship. Weapons. The International Institute for Strategic Studies, IISS, a leading think tank, said the war in Ukraine had undermined Russia's confidence in its conventional forces and increased the importance of non-strategic nuclear weapons, NSNWs, as a means of deterring and defeating NATO in any potential future conflict. NSNWs include all nuclear weapons with a range of up to 5,500 kilometers, 3,400 miles. As said, the logic of using such weapons would be to escalate a conflict in a controlled fashion, either to prevent the US and NATO from engaging, or to coerce them into war termination on Russian terms. Russia-Ukraine war, list of key events. As the war enters its day, these are the main developments. Fighting. The Ukrainian Air Force said Russia launched drone and missile attacks across the country, hitting both civilian and critical infrastructure. The Air Force said Moscow attacked the central Poltava region with 2 Iskander missiles. It also launched 3 S-300 surface-to-air missiles over the Donetsk region in the east. Air defense systems destroyed 4 of 8 Russia-launched drones overnight, the Air Force said. 3 civilians were injured in the attacks. Ukraine said Russia must provide proof that an Ilyushin-76 military transport plane that crashed in the Belgorod region last week was carrying dozens of Ukrainian prisoners of war, as Moscow claims. Kirill Budanov, the chief of Ukraine's GOR military intelligence, said Kyiv had no verifiable information about who was on the plane. Ukraine's coordination staff for the treatment of prisoners of war said relatives of POWs on a list of names provided by Moscow were unable to identify their loved ones in crash site photos provided by Russian authorities. Politics and diplomacy. The Security Service of Ukraine, SBU, said it had charged 5 people for corruption in weapons procurement. The SBU accuses the 5 of conspiring with Ministry of Defense officials to embezzle almost $40 million earmarked to buy 100,000 mortar shells for the war. If found guilty, the group faces up to 12 years in prison. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky declared his income publicly for the first time, as part of his drive to promote transparency and root out corruption. Zelensky said that in 2021, the year before Russia began its full-scale invasion, he and his family had an income of 10.8 million hryvnias, $286,168. In 2022, the family's income dropped to 3.7 million hryvnias, $98,535, as the war cut the family's rental income from property. Russian officials in Ukrainian regions occupied by Moscow's forces said the Ukrainian language had been stripped of any official status, effectively banning it from public use. The International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, said Chief Rafael Grossi will visit Ukraine, including its capital and the Russian-occupied Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the week after next. Weapons. Zelensky warned that a drop in military aid from the United States to Ukraine would send a bad signal, as right-wing Republicans in the U.S. block additional support unless it is linked to changes in U.S. border policy. Passivity from the United States or the lack of support would be a bad signal, Zelensky told German national broadcaster ARD. NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg, who began a visit to the U.S. on Sunday, said continued U.S. military funding for Ukraine had a key deterrent message for China. U.S. President Joe Biden has asked Congress to approve $61 billion in new aid to Ukraine. Stoltenberg said it was a good deal, noting that while the aid was a fraction of the Pentagon's overall budget, it had enabled Ukrainian forces to destroy and degrade the Russian military. Stoltenberg is due to meet members of Congress on Tuesday. Russia-Ukraine war, list of key events. As the war enters its day, these are the main developments. Fighting. Russian President Vladimir Putin said the Ilyushin